in Jugtart Parn. The dog had already put 3 handlers on the ground that morning, and Captain Devon Marsh was running out of patience. It wasn't the kind of losing patience that shows on a man's face, a fear. Marsh had spent 22 years with the Joint Task Force 2, and before that, 2 tours with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry in Kandahar. He learned a long time ago to keep his face as blank and unreadable as a fence post. His jaw was tight, and the men around him could read that well enough. When Marsh's jaw went tight, you stepped back and gave him room. The dog's name, according to the transfer paperwork, was Delta. He was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, 73 pounds of compact muscle and raw intelligence, jet black except for a rust-colored chest and a pale mask around his muzzle. On paper, it was exceptional. In practice, he was a catastrophe. His training scores from the RCMP's Police Dog Service Training Center in Innisfail were some of the highest on record. His bite work was textbook perfect, his tracking ability bordered on the supernatural, and his obedience in controlled settings had been rated outstanding by 2 separate evaluators. That had been 8 months ago, at Dusty Fields. Now he stood in the middle of the training enclosure at CFB Valcartier, 20 kilometers north of Quebec City, and he was not biting anyone, was not tracking anything, and was not obeying a single soul, simply shaking. The tremor ran from the tips of his forward paws, up through his haunches in a continuous, barely visible vibration, the idling of an engine that was never meant to be left running this long. His eyes were fixed on something that wasn't there. 80 fools. They were focused about 6 feet in front of him, and roughly 3 feet off the ground, locked onto a point in empty air with the absolute conviction of a dog who could see what the rest of the world couldn't. The handler on the lead, Corporal Elodie Fontaine, was one of the most decorated dog handlers in the unit. She had worked 4 previous dogs through active deployment cycles, 2 of them in Afghanistan fields, and she had never once failed to bond with an animal in her care, as patient, methodical, and had a quality that the older handlers described as a gift, a particular stillness she could project that most working dogs responded to within hours of meeting her. She had been working Delta for 6 weeks. He hadn't responded to anything. He followed basic movement commands sometimes, when the weather was calm and the yard was quiet, and nothing unexpected happened under any simulated stress, any noise above a certain threshold, any rapid movement in his peripheral vision. He simply went somewhere else inside his own head and left his body standing there, shaking. Fontaine's arm was exhausted. She had been maintaining light pressure on the lead for 40 minutes, not restraining him, just keeping contact the way she'd been taught, air. Her elbow ached from the sustained tension of a dog that was neither pulling forward nor yielding back, but simply existing in a state of terrible suspension. He's going to tip over if he keeps this up, this below from the rail. He wasn't being cruel, searing. He was stating a physical fact with the detached tone of a man who had watched too many animals and too many people reach their limits and couldn't afford to feel everything that implied. Marsh said nothing, watching the dog's feet. There was a maintenance crew working on the far side of the compound. They'd been there since early morning, replacing a section of drainage pipe that had fractured over the winter. The Quebec winters did that, pushed themselves into any gap or weakness in a structure, and expanded until something gave. The crew was 3 men and a woman from a local contracting company. The same outfit the base had used for grounds and infrastructure work for the better part of a decade. They were reliable and unobtrusive, which was exactly what the base administration wanted. They arrived before the unit started their morning routines. They worked quietly, left without causing a fuss. One of them had stopped working. Marsh noticed him from across the yard because of the stillness of her. In the same way that Delta's shaking stood out against the quiet of the enclosure, This man's stillness stood out against the movement of the crew around him. The others were still digging, hauling pipe sections, still consulting the work order clipped to a board. Thus one man had set down his shovel with the particular care of someone who had just heard something they weren't expecting, and he was standing at the edge of the work area with his eyes on the dog. He was old in a general sense, but specifically, precisely, unmistakably old, in the way that certain men become. After decades of outdoor work and outdoor weather and the particular kind of wear that comes from carrying things heavier than shovels for longer than is good for a body, as his face was deeply lined, the skin pulled close against the bones beneath it. His hands, even from this distance, enlarged and slightly crooked look of hands that had been broken and healed, and broken again, as wearing canvas work pants and a faded orange safety vest over a gray flannel shirt, and a battered hard hat that he'd pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he'd forgotten it was there. He was watching Delta the way a doctor watches a patient, not with alarm, not with pity, but with the focused and somewhat sorrowful attention of someone conducting a diagnosis. "Who is that?" Marsh said to no one in particular. Below shrugged. "Crew's been here since 6, individually." Marsh watched the old man for another moment. He wasn't moving toward the enclosure. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just standing there, outside the restricted zone, watching a dog shake. There was nothing in that picture that required intervention. It's something about it made the back of Marsh's neck feel the way it felt, in the seconds before something happened that he hadn't anticipated. He filed it away and went back to watching Fontaine work. Just 20 minutes later, the old man was still there. This time, Delta had noticed him. It happened the way these things always happened with working dogs, which was to say it happened faster than a human eye could fully track. And then it was simply a fact that existed in the world. One moment the dog was staring at his fixed point in empty air. Just his head had swung 45 degrees, and both triangular ears had come forward and up, edge pressed flat against his skull, but raised and oriented like two small radar dishes aimed directly at the maintenance worker standing at the far fence line. The shaking had stopped. Fontaine felt it through the lead before she saw it. The quality of the tension changing, shifting from the dull, constant drag of an animal mired in its own distress to something sharper and more present. She looked down at Delta. She looked at where he was looking. She looked back at Marsh. Marsh was already moving toward the fence. "Sir," called below, "that's the contractor work zone." "I know where it is," Marsh said. He crossed the yard at a walk that was not quite a march, but shared its quality of purposefulness. He reached the inner fence and stopped. The old man was perhaps 30 meters beyond it, the edge of the drainage trench, and he hadn't moved. His eyes were still on the dog, as a restricted training area, Marsh said. His voice carried the flat, carrying quality of a man who had given orders in wind and rain and gunfire, and didn't need to raise it to be heard. "I'd appreciate it if you'd get back to your work." The old man turned his head and looked at Marsh. His eyes were a pale greenish gray, the color of the St. Lawrence in October, and they held a quality that Marsh recognized before he could name it. That particular flatness that looks like nothing until you've seen it enough times to know it's not nothing at all. It was the look of someone who had spent a long time deciding what to care about and had arrived at a very short list. "That dog," the old man said. His voice was graveled and unhurried. The accent of someone from somewhere between New Brunswick and the back end of Ontario, the particular Canadian flatness that swallowed its vowels quietly. "His name." "That is not your concern," Marsh said. "Sir." The old man nodded, as if this answer were reasonable and also completely useless. He looked back at Delta. The dog was still watching him, shaking. "What do you call him?" he said. Delta. That's just what his file says. Another nod. The old man reached up and took off his hard hat and turned it in his hands once. His white hair was cropped short, as a military cut grown out by several months, but unmistakably originating in one. That's not his name, he said. He put the hard hat back on and started walking toward the fence. Hold on, Marsh said. I said this is a restricted area. You need to stop right there. The old man stopped. Patience. He was perhaps 10 meters from the inner fence now, close enough that Marsh could see the particular set of his shoulders, the way his weight was distributed, F-Lord, balanced in a manner that had nothing to do with pipe fitting. I'm not going to cause any trouble, the man said. I'm not going anywhere near your handlers or your people. I just want to stand here for a minute. Why? The old man looked at him again with those flat gray-green eyes. Because I think that dog is having a very bad day. And I think I might be able to help with that. And I think you know as well as I do that whatever you've been doing hasn't. Marsh held the look for a moment. Behind him, he could hear Fontaine keeping the lead steady, could hear Below's silence, which was louder than anything Below might have said. He thought about protocol, thought about the 6 weeks of failed integration sessions and the recommendation from the behavioral consultant in Ottawa that had arrived last Tuesday suggesting Delta be retired from service and placed in a civilian adoption program. That's the inner fence, Marsh said. He stepped aside. The old man moved forward until he was at the chain link and stopped there, gripping the fence with both hands at shoulder height. Not pulling at it, just resting his weight against it. Looked at Delta. Delta was trembling again, but differently. Not the hollow, dissociative shaking of an animal lost in its own past. This was something more focused, more electrical. The trembling of a dog that is trying to reconcile what its nose is telling it with what the rest of its body has been told to believe for 8 months. The old man said nothing for a long moment. He breathed, the wind carry whatever it carried from him across the yard and into the enclosure, and he just stood there, patient as a rock in a field. Then, very quietly, in a voice just large enough to cross the distance, he said a single word. Ghost. The effect was instantaneous and total, and it silenced every person in the yard. Delta's head came up. Oh. Not in the reactive, startled way of an animal responding to a sound, but in the slow, oceanic way of something surfacing from very deep water. It has been down so long. It has almost forgotten what the surface looks like, that finds it anyway by instinct. The trembling stopped as if a current had been switched off. The dog's tail, a Fontaine had not seen move voluntarily in 6 weeks, lifted once, then again. Then the dog sat down. Just sat, on his own, without a command, without a hand signal, without pressure on the lead. He sat, and he looked at the old man at the fence with the absolute undivided attention of an animal that has found its compass bearing after a very long time pointing at nothing. Fontaine's hand was slack on the lead. She looked at Marsh. Marsh was looking at the old man. The old man was looking at the dog. And, for just a moment, before he composed himself, before the flat and weathered expression reasserted itself, something moved across his face that had no military language for it. It was simply grief breaking open, and something better rushing in to fill the space. Good boy, the old man said, barely above a whisper. He straightened up and turned to Marsh. His expression was composed again. Careful. I'll get back to the pipe work, he said. Stay where you are, Marsh said. His voice was very level. What is your name? The old man looked at him for a moment. They call me Walt around here. I've been doing work on this base for 4 years. Your full name? A pause. Not a guilty pause, not a nervous one. The pause of a man deciding something. Walter Kane. Marsh filed that away. Mr. Kane, how do you know that dog? I don't, Walter said. Not anymore. Told me he was dead. The words fell into the yard like stones dropped into still water. Marsh watched the ripples. When? 8 months ago. Walter's jaw shifted. I was at a medical facility in Edmonton. I'd been there for about 3 months at that point. I was told my dog had died of his injuries in transit. I was shown paperwork. Edmonton, Esquien-Rosresi Rehabilitation Hospital, or the military wing at the University of Alberta Hospital. Either one handled the serious cases that came back from overseas postings not quite whole. Marsh thought about the dog's transfer papers he had read 3 times in the past 2 weeks, because nothing about them made sense. The dog had come from a unit that was listed only by a code number. The previous handler's name was redacted. The transfer origin was an Air Force base in Cold Lake, Alberta, which was about 4 hours northeast of Edmonton. What unit? Marsh said. Ella shook his head, very slightly. The shake of a man who has said certain things for so long under so much pressure that the refusal has become involuntary. I can't help you if you don't talk to me, as Marsh said. You don't need to help me, Captain, Walter said. And the fact that he'd identified the rank without looking at the insignia from across 2 fences and the width of a training yard for was the most information he had given Marsh yet. Just need to let me take that dog home. The audacity of it landed somewhere between absurd and completely logical, the way certain true things do. Marsh turned back to his unit. Fontaine, still a fence. Fontaine blinked. Sir, bring the dog to the fence. She walked Delta across the yard. He came without resistance, without hesitation, without the sideways drift and constant scanning that had characterized every movement he'd made for 6 weeks. Untima. He walked with his head up and his eyes fixed on the old man at the fence, and his whole body flowing forward with a certainty that looked, from the outside, like the most natural thing in the world. Uppy Fields. When they reached the fence, Delta pushed his nose through the chain link, and the old man pressed his palm flat against the fence and let the dog breathe him in. The dog made a sound low in his throat that was not a growl and not a whine, and was not a sound Fontaine had heard him make before. Ale was moving continuously now. Walter Kane pressed his forehead briefly against the fence, his eyes closed. 1 second. 2. Then he straightened up. He's been in trauma since the transfer, he said. Doesn't have PTSD in the clinical sense. He's grieving. There's a difference, and the difference matters. He looked at Fontaine. You couldn't have reached him. It has nothing to do with your skill. Oh, he wasn't looking for a handler. I was looking for a specific person. And he'd been told, in the only language a dog understands, that that person was gone. He'd been behaving accordingly. Fontaine looked at the dog, then at the old man, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. Marsh spent the rest of the afternoon in his office, and what he found in the time between 3 o'clock and 5:30 made the afternoon feel considerably longer than 2.5 hours. Walter Kane, as a name, produced almost nothing through standard base administration channels. A contractor's license issued in Quebec, a driver's license with a Portneuf County address, his own. 4 years of maintenance invoices submitted to CFB Valcartier's facilities management office. All of it clean, all of it consistent, all of it, the kind of documentation that a careful person constructs when they want to look like nothing in particular. It was the dog's file that told the real story, or rather, it was the absence of story in the dog's file that told it. The transfer paperwork from Cold Lake cited a unit designation that Marsh's intelligence contact in Ottawa confirmed. After a 40-minute delay that meant someone was being consulted, designation used by the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command for certain embedded advisory and reconnaissance elements, that operated in places that were officially not happening. The handler name field was blacked out in ink, So thorough it had gone through to the next page. Behavioral notes from the receiving unit at Valcartier, which Marsh had read before, but now read differently. AUKUS noted that the dog had been non-responsive to any vocal command in any language that had been attempted, which included English, French, and German, which was standard for imported working dogs. Up what the notes didn't say, and what Marsh now understood was that they had never tried the dog's actual name. He sent Corporal Fontaine home for the evening and took the dog himself. He didn't take him outside, sat in the kennel with him for a while, which was something he hadn't done with a dog since he was a sergeant on Dusty Fields, when it was still considered acceptable for an officer to sit on the floor of a kennel at 6 p.m. for no reason other than to be present. The dog sat at the far end of the enclosure and watched him with calm, patient eyes and did not shake. Marsh looked at the dog for a long time. "Ghost," he said. The dog's ears came forward. "Yeah," Marsh said quietly. "I thought so." He made a call that night from his personal phone, his Fields. The number he called was not in his contacts, was not something he had dialed before. It was the kind of number you memorize in certain training environments because writing it down is specifically discouraged. It rang twice and a voice answered. That was neither young nor old and gave no name. Marsh told the voice what he had found. He told it about the dog, about Walter Kane, about Cold Lake and Edmonton, and the blacked-out name on a transfer form. He listened to what the voice said in response, about 90 seconds, and ended with a very specific instruction. Delivered in a tone that made it clear the instruction had been given because it was good advice, and not because it was a command. "Alone, Captain. The dog is where he needs to be, or he will be shortly. The man has earned more than what he's got, and the least of what he's owed is to be left in peace." Marsh sat with that for a moment. Any of his record buried to protect him or to protect the operation? A pause. "Both," the voice said, and hung up. He drove out to the Portneuf County address the following morning in his personal truck. It was an hour west of Quebec City, a 2-lane road that curved between farmland and woodlot, and the occasional gas station and grain elevator. Accurate. The address resolved to a property at the end of a gravel lane, Fields. A modest white clapboard house in reasonable repair, with a barn that had been recently re-roofed, and a vegetable garden that was just starting to show green despite the late spring, a half-disassembled tractor in the side yard, and a cord of firewood that had been split and stacked with the kind of geometric precision that a person either has naturally or acquires in a context that has nothing to do with firewood, just his own Dusty Fields. He found Walter Kane at the back of the property, splitting what remained of the cord, working the maul with an efficiency and economy of movement that suggested the work was automatic, something the body did while the mind was elsewhere. The dog was there, no lead, no collar, lying in the grass at the edge of the woodpile with his head on his paws and his eyes half closed in the pale morning sun. He raised his head when Marsh's truck came up the lane. He looked at the truck. He looked at Walter. Walter said something to him in a low voice, and the dog put his head back down. Marsh got out of the truck and walked over. Walter set the maul down against the block and waited. "I was told to leave it alone," Marsh said. "Sounds right," Walter said. "I'm not very good at that." Walter's expression held something that might have been the beginning of a smile if it had decided to go any further. "No," he said. "You wouldn't be." Marsh looked at the dog, then at the man. "I'm not here officially. I'm here because I need to understand what I saw." Walter looked at him for a long moment, then sat down on the splitting block. It was a considered decision to stay in the conversation. He picked up a thin piece of split wood from the ground and turned it in his hands. "His name was Ghost before anyone put a number on him," Walter said. "For 3 years. What we did In those 3 years, I can't tell you specifically. I can tell you that we were in places where having a dog who could move quietly and find things and trust his handler's judgment without confirmation was the difference between coming home and not. Paused. On our last deployment, things went wrong. They go wrong. That's the nature of the work. We were in a situation where extraction was delayed, and the people who were looking for us were very good at their jobs. He stopped, looked at the piece of wood. He found me when I couldn't find myself, Walter said. In the dark, injured, in a location I couldn't identify. He found me, and he stayed with me, and when the threat moved in close, he put himself between it and me in a way that cost him significantly. He touched his left side without seeming to realize he was doing it. Automatic gesture of someone whose body has filed an old injury under permanent reference. We both got out. We were both brought to the medical facility in Edmonton. I was conscious for parts of it. I knew he was alive when I went into surgery. When I came out the other side, I was told he had died in the night from internal bleeding. I was shown paperwork. I was not in a condition to question it. The piece of wood snapped cleanly in his hands. He set both halves down. "Why did they lie to you?" Marsh asked. "The operational context required that both of us disappear," Walter said. "I got a new identity and a patch of land in Portneuf County and a contractor's license. It was clean work, competently done, and I understand the reasoning. What I don't understand, and what I think was a mistake by someone who didn't think through the whole equation, was sending him to a kenneling program under a different name and expecting him to become a different dog." Marsh thought about the 6 weeks of failed sessions, Fontaine's patients, Ottawa consultant's report, the recommendation for civilian adoption. He thought about the dog lying in the grass, with his eyes half closed, breathing slowly in the morning sun. He thought about the difference between a dog with PTSD and a dog that was grieving, and whether that difference had ever been documented anywhere, and whether it should be deteriorated after the transfer, Marsh said. Every metric dropped. He passed all his initial assessments in Innisfail, and then something happened about 5 months in. Walter nodded. That's when he would have stopped believing I might come. The sentence sat in the spring air between them. Marsh looked at the dog. It had rolled onto his side now. One rear leg extended, soaking up the weak Quebec sun with the focused dedication of an animal that has decided to be warm and is not going to be distracted from it. The Navy has a retirement program, Marsh said finally. CANSOFCOM has one too, for dogs with special operations service history. It includes veterinary coverage, official recognition, a small monthly stipend for the adopting handler. Walter looked at him. Paperwork would need to be filed under the dog's operational name, Marsh said. His real name, Ghost. And the handler of record would need to be identified by his actual name, not a contractor's license. Walter was quiet for a moment. The mall leaned against the splitting block between them. The tractor sat in its incomplete state in the side yard. The garden was coming up green in the late spring cool. It would require someone to open a file that certain people have invested some effort in keeping closed, Walter said, dead. It would, Marsh agreed. I'm comfortable with that. Another pause. Walter looked at the dog, and the dog, as if aware of the attention, lifted his head and looked back at him with calm, steady eyes. Walter Kane, he said quietly, is the name on the contractor's license. I know, Marsh said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small notebook, the kind with a soft cover and spiral binding. He held a pen. But it's not the name on the transfer order from Cold Lake, under the redaction. I have a reasonable degree of confidence that with the right authorizations, which I intend to request this week, I can read what's under that ink. He looked at the old man. It would save time if you told me now. Walter Kane looked at him for a long moment with those gray-green October eyes. Then he looked at the dog one more time. Ghost had sat up and was watching both of them now, head slightly tilted, with the expression of a dog participating in a conversation he understands better than either party realizes. Walter exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to carry something with it on the way out. "Sergeant Major Eldon Carew," he said, "Royal Canadian Regiment. Retired, allegedly." Marsh wrote it down. 3 weeks later, a small informal gathering was held at the Valcartier base. There were no cameras, no ceremony in the official sense, no flags or remarks for the public record. Marsh's unit assembled in the yard where it had started, the same dust and chain link and the same pale Quebec sky. Fontaine was there. Below was there. Junior handlers, who had attempted to work with the dog before Fontaine, were there, standing in a loose, honest formation. Eldon Carew came in his own truck. The dog rode in the cab with him, sitting in the passenger seat with his nose against the window glass. When Carew got out, Ghost stayed close to his left leg. The trained heel position maintained not out of obedience but out of preference, out of the simple choice of an animal that knows where it belongs and has decided not to be anywhere else. Fontaine came forward first. She looked at the dog, then at Carew, and said, "I need you to know I tried everything I knew." Carew looked at her with a kindness that had nothing soft in it. "I know," he said. "You kept him alive. That's what mattered, the whole thing." Fontaine blinked and looked away, and did not say anything else, but seemed to have resolved something. Marsh stepped forward and handed Carew an envelope. Archie Fields. Inside was the official retirement documentation for one military working dog, Ghost, formerly designated K7D. Handler of record listed as Sergeant Major Eldon Carew, RC Regged, with a service commendation attached for conduct in operational environments that remained classified, but had been formally acknowledged at a level sufficient to make the commendation meaningful. Other field foils. There was also a small card handwritten from a flag officer in Ottawa who had received Marsh's request and had taken a day to respond, and then had responded fully and without obstruction, which told Marsh something about the flag officer and also something about Carew that the files had been unable to. Carew read the card and put it in his shirt pocket without showing it to anyone. At the young handlers gathered in the yard, men and women who were at the beginning of things he had spent decades in the middle of. And he said, "The bond is not a technique. I can't teach it to you as a method. What I can tell you is that an animal working at this level is not equipment, fouls. And the moment you start thinking of it as equipment is the moment you lose the thing that makes it work. You're not commanding a tool, asking a partner to trust that the direction you're pointing is worth walking into. That's a different thing entirely, and it takes longer to build than any of your training schedules account for." He paused. Ghost leaned against his leg. "Give it the time it needs," Carew said. "The work will wait." On the drive back to Portneuf County, the sun was going down through the spruce trees along the highway, just coming through the passenger window at a low angle and laying itself across the dog's back in stripes of gold. Ghost had his head resting on Carew's thigh, his eyes half closed, watching the road go by in the particular way of a dog that has no concerns about the destination, because the destination is already present. Dove with one hand on the wheel. Carew and one hand resting on the dog's back, and neither of them needed anything that wasn't already in the cab of that truck. Moving west through the long Canadian evening toward a piece of land in Portneuf County where the garden was coming up and the firewood was split and stacked, and there was, finally, enough quiet for two old soldiers to rest.